In the autumn of 359 AD, according to the eyewitness account of Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus, 20,000 Roman soldiers trapped inside the black basalt walls of Amida faced a Persian army that outnumbered them 5-1. For 73 days, they held. When the city finally fell, the attackers had lost 30,000 men, more dead than the entire garrison they came to destroy. Think about those numbers. Contemporary chronicles document 30,000 Persian casualties to capture a city defended by 20,000. The attackers lost more men than the defenders had soldiers. This appears in both Roman military records and later Persian historical traditions. A pyrrhic victory so complete that Shapur the Second, the greatest Persian king in 300 years, won the city but lost his invasion. By the end of this video, you'll understand how historical sources reveal why a 73-day siege became the most expensive tactical victory in ancient warfare. I'm about to reveal 3 documented facts that will change how you see ancient siege warfare. First, the intelligence betrayal documented in Roman records that shaped Persian strategy. A defector whose information was so valuable, he was granted honors reserved for Persian nobility. Second, why a single ballista bolt, recorded by an eyewitness, transformed a strategic operation into a blood feud that killed 30,000 men. And third, the structural failure documented in military chronicles that doomed 20,000 defenders in a single afternoon. But here's what makes this siege historically extraordinary. How did a Roman garrison, outnumbered 5-1, inflict casualties equal to 150% of their own strength? What tactical decision, recorded by our eyewitness source, led the greatest Persian commander of the age to sacrifice 30,000 warriors for a single fortress? Why did contemporary chroniclers, both Roman and Persian traditions, call this siege a catastrophe for the victor? How could sophisticated siege engineering, documented in technical detail, produce the highest attacker casualty rate in ancient military history? Why did the city's walls, still standing today in Diyarbakir, Turkey, prove too formidable to destroy even after Persian victory? This is the story of Shapur the Second, the king of kings who reigned for 70 years, versus Count Ammianus and 20,000 Romans who transformed their death into strategic victory. To understand how documented historical sources reveal this impossibility, we need to step back to the mid-4th century, when the Roman Empire's eastern frontier was preparing for collapse. The year 359 AD marked the convergence of 2 opposite trajectories. The Roman Empire, despite controlling the Mediterranean world, was bleeding from self-inflicted wounds. Emperor Constantius II ruled from a court poisoned by paranoia, where successful generals were more dangerous than foreign enemies. Just 5 years earlier, he'd executed his own Caesar, Gallus, for the crime of competent administration in the East. The charge was cruelty and overreach. The reality was that Gallus had made powerful enemies among the court eunuchs who whispered in the emperor's ear. While the western provinces faced Germanic invasions, Constantius's attention fixed on suspected usurpers within his own ranks. Elite troops that should have defended Mesopotamia were scattered across Gaul under Julian, another Caesar whose military success was already making the emperor nervous. The eastern provinces, drained of money and men, awaited catastrophe. Facing this crumbling frontier stood a man who had spent 50 years preparing for this moment. Shapur the Second, king of kings of the Sasanian Empire, had been crowned according to Persian tradition before he was even born. Nobles placed the royal diadem on his mother's belly. By 359, he'd occupied the Persian throne for 7 decades, the longest reign in Sasanian history. At approximately 50 years old, he was at the peak of both physical power and strategic sophistication. Contemporary sources describe him as an imposing figure, often seen mounted on a war charger and wearing a distinctive golden crown fashioned in the image of a ram's head, studded with precious stones. This crown served dual purposes. On the battlefield, it identified him to his troops from great distances. In the royal court, it symbolized his divine right and connection to the ancient Persian past that predated even Alexander's conquest. But Shapur's path to this moment had been paved with failure. Between 337 and 350 AD, he'd launched 3 separate sieges against Nisibis, Rome's strongest eastern fortress. 3 times, the city's defenders had thrown him back. The first siege in 337 lasted for 63 days before Shapur withdrew. The second in 346 ended in similar frustration. The third in 350 was the most ambitious, a 100-day investment that saw Persian engineers dam the river to flood the city. The walls held, the defenders endured. Shapur retreated. These defeats taught him a brutal lesson. Roman fortresses, properly defended and adequately supplied, could bleed Persian armies white without falling. Frontal assaults on the strongest positions were strategic suicide. So Shapur changed his approach. Between 353 and 358, he turned eastward, campaigning against the Sionites and other Central Asian nomadic peoples. Chronicles record that rather than simply crushing these tribes, he forced them into alliance through a combination of military pressure and diplomatic finesse. The most significant acquisition was Grumbates, king of the Chionites, whose hardened cavalry warriors would become a crucial component of Shapur's renewed western offensive. By 358, the King of Kings commanded not just Persian heavy cavalry, but a coalition of the deadliest mounted warriors from the steppes of Central Asia to the mountains of the Caucasus. The target of this coalition was Mesopotamia, the borderland between empires. Roman control rested on a network of fortified cities designed to act as interlocking bulwarks. Amida, Nisibis, Singara, and Bazabde formed a defensive line that leveraged the natural barriers of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Amida specifically occupied a strategic plateau on the west bank of the Tigris. The river washed its southern and eastern bases, providing a formidable natural barrier. To the north, the city was shadowed by the peaks of the Taurus Mountains. To the west, it opened onto the Mesopotamian plains. The city's fortifications had been significantly expanded by Constantius II around 349 AD. Ammianus Marcellinus, who would later witness the siege firsthand, provides detailed architectural descriptions that modern archaeology has confirmed with remarkable precision. The walls were constructed using local black basalt, volcanic rock of exceptional durability that explains why large portions still stand today. The fortifications stretched for approximately 5.8 kilometers and featured over 80 towers and 4 primary gates. A spring at the foot of the citadel provided reliable water even during the most intense blockade. As autumn turned toward winter in 359, Shapur's coalition was nearly ready. But the King of Kings had learned from his failures at Nisibis. This time, he wouldn't rely solely on Persian courage and siege towers. This time, he possessed something more valuable than 10,000 additional cavalry. He possessed perfect intelligence about Roman weakness, and that intelligence came from a traitor. Inside the Roman bureaucracy of Mesopotamia, a man named Antoninus was compiling the most valuable intelligence dossier in 4th century warfare. Wealthy merchant turned accountant, member of the elite protectores domestici, the imperial bodyguard, Fluent in Latin and Greek, with access to every military record in the eastern provinces, he was the perfect insider. And Roman corruption was transforming him into Persia's most dangerous weapon. Ammianus Marcellinus provides a detailed account of Antoninus's fall from Roman service. His story exemplifies the rot spreading through the late Roman administrative system. Antoninus had risen through a combination of commercial success and bureaucratic competence to become an accountant on the staff of the governor of Mesopotamia. His fluency in both Latin and Greek, along with his financial acumen, made him valuable. His position as a protector domesticus, technically a member of the imperial bodyguard but in practice a high-ranking staff officer, gave him access to military planning, troop distributions, supply chain logistics, and the financial records that revealed which provinces were bankrupt and which garrisons were under strength. According to Ammianus, Antoninus was driven to treason by what the chronicler calls unjust duns. Essentially, he was financially ruined by powerful men who used their influence to extort or defraud him. When Antoninus sought legal redress through the Roman court system, he discovered that justice was for sale to the highest bidder. His complaints were ignored. His appeals were rejected. The men who had wronged him were too well connected, too protected by the web of patronage and bribery that characterized Constantius's court. Faced with ruin and lacking any recourse within the system, Antoninus made a calculated decision. If Rome had abandoned him, he would abandon Rome. But Antoninus didn't simply flee in desperation. Contemporary sources document that his defection was a masterpiece of long-term planning that spanned several years. He purchased a farm at Iaspis, a location on the banks of the Tigris River, carefully chosen for its proximity to Persian-controlled territory. This farm served as his base for secret contact with Shapur, the Persian governor of the frontier region. Communication across the Tigris required both courage and cunning. Ammianus records that Antoninus used swimmers to ferry messages back and forth across the river, a dangerous method that required absolute trust and meticulous timing. While maintaining this covert channel, Antoninus systematically compiled his intelligence dossier. He documented troop distributions across the eastern provinces. He mapped supply dumps and identified which garrisons were well-stocked and which were desperate for provisions. He analyzed the financial records to determine which cities could sustain a siege and which would collapse economically under prolonged investment. He noted the locations of elite units and identified the competent commanders versus the political appointees. Most crucially, he documented the command dysfunction that was paralyzing Roman strategic response. When his preparations were complete and the timing was optimal. With Roman elite forces deployed west under Julian and the eastern frontier weakened, Antoninus executed his escape. Under cover of darkness, he transported his entire household, including his family and slaves, across the Tigris. The operation succeeded without detection. Shapur personally escorted Antoninus to the Persian court. Shapur the Second's reception of the defector reveals how highly the Persians valued his intelligence. The King of Kings granted Antoninus the distinction of the turban, a prestigious emblem that allowed him to participate in the royal council. Chronicles note that very few non-Persians in Sasanian history were ever granted this honor. It signified that Antoninus was now considered a trusted advisor to the King of Kings himself, and the advice Antoninus provided would reshape Persian strategy for the entire 359 campaign. Historical sources indicate that Antoninus urged Shapur to abandon the traditional Persian focus on border fortresses. Nisibis, he counseled, was too strong and too well defended to fall without catastrophic casualties. Singara and Bezabde, while less formidable, would still exact a heavy price. Instead, Antoninus proposed a revolutionary strategy. bypass the strongest positions entirely, and strike deep into the Roman heartland. The targets should be Syria, and especially Antioch, one of the great cities of the Roman East. The timing was perfect. Julian's campaigns in Gaul had stripped the eastern provinces of their best troops. The field army in the east was commanded by men chosen for political loyalty rather than military competence. The financial exhaustion of the frontier provinces meant that garrisons were understrength and supplies were inadequate. Roman command structure was fractured by rivalry and court intrigue. If Shapur moved quickly with overwhelming force, he could trigger a collapse of Roman authority across the entire region before reinforcements could arrive from the west. Armed with Antoninus's intelligence, Shapur abandoned 30 years of failed frontier sieges. What he planned next would shock even his own generals. By spring of 359, the largest Persian army in decades was massing on the Tigris frontier. And the Romans were about to discover that their greatest enemy wasn't Persian steel. It was their own paralyzed command structure. While Shapur assembled the most formidable Persian army since the early Sasanian period, the Roman Eastern Command was tearing itself apart. Two men held equal authority over Rome's defense: Ursicinus, the Magister Equitum, a veteran who understood Persian warfare intimately, and Sabinianus, the Magister Peditum, whose primary qualification was court connections. They despised each other, and their conflict would doom Mesopotamia. Ursicinus embodied the old Roman military tradition, a career soldier who'd risen through the ranks based on demonstrated competence. He'd commanded cavalry forces across multiple Persian campaigns. He understood Sasanian tactics, recognized the threat that Shapur posed, and had the respect of the troops under his command. But Ursicinus had made a fatal error in the Byzantine politics of Constantius's court. He'd earned the enmity of Eusebius, the Grand Chamberlain. Eusebius was one of the powerful eunuchs who controlled access to the emperor and whispered constantly about military plots and potential usurpers. Ammianus Marcellinus, who served as a staff officer under Ursicinus and accompanied him on multiple campaigns, provides detailed accounts of how court intrigue systematically undermined an experienced general. The result was that despite holding the rank of Magister Equitum per Orientum, master of cavalry for the entire East, Ursicinus found himself relegated to advisory roles while actual command authority shifted to his rival. That rival was Sabinianus, appointed as Magister Peditum per Orientum, master of infantry for the East, sometime around 358 or early 359. Ammianus's portrait of Sabinianus is scathing, portraying him as a man of limited military ability whose primary skill was navigating court politics. Whether this characterization is entirely fair remains debated by modern historians, but the outcomes speak clearly. Sabinianus commanded the main Roman field army in the east, estimated by scholars at between 15,000 and 25,000 troops, and he positioned this force at Edessa, approximately 100 miles west of Amida. When the Persian threat materialized, Sabinianus refused to move. He claimed he had strict orders from the emperor not to risk the field army in open engagement with Shapur's forces. Whether these orders actually existed or were simply Sabinianus's excuse for inaction, the effect was catastrophic. The frontier was left to defend itself. Ursicinus recognized the danger immediately. Despite lacking formal authority over the main army, he attempted to organize a mobile defense. He ordered the destruction of bridges over major rivers to slow the Persian advance. He commanded the evacuation of rural civilians to fortified cities. He tried to concentrate scattered garrison units into defensible positions. But without Sabinianus's cooperation and without control of the field army, These orders were largely ignored or executed half-heartedly. The result was chaos as the Persian host swept across Mesopotamia. Rural populations fled in panic toward whatever fortress seemed closest. Military units retreated in disorder, and the city of Amida found itself transforming from a regional administrative center into a refugee camp under siege conditions. The garrison that would defend Amida was never intended to hold the force that crowded behind its walls by late summer 359. The standard complement was Legio V Parthica, the 5th Parthian Legion, supported by native Mesopotamian auxiliary units. Perhaps 5,000 to 6,000 soldiers total to defend a city and serve as a regional base. But as Shapur's army ravaged the countryside, panic drove both military units and civilians toward Amida's formidable walls. The chroniclers document the arrival of multiple legion detachments fleeing the Persian advance. Legio 30 Ulpia Victrix arrived in what Ammianus describes as chaotic retreat. A detachment estimated at 2,000 to 3,000 men. Elements of Legio X Fretensis, normally based in Jerusalem, had been in Mesopotamia and now sought refuge, adding perhaps 1,000 to 2,000 more soldiers. Most significantly, 2 Gallic legions, the Magnentiaci and Decentiaci, totaling between 2,000 and 3,000 troops, entered the city despite being viewed with suspicion by the imperial court. These units had previously supported the usurper Magnentius and were considered politically unreliable. Elite specialist units also crowded into Amida. The Comites Sagittarii, household mounted archers numbering between 500 and 1,000, and the Superventores and Praeventores, specialized scout and light cavalry units, adding another 600 to 1,000 men. Modern historians, working from Ammianus's unit lists and typical 4th century legion strengths, estimate the total military population inside Amida at approximately 20,000 soldiers. But the military personnel were vastly outnumbered by terrified civilians. Rural Mesopotamians, urban refugees from smaller towns, families fleeing the approaching Persian host, all converged on Amida. Ammianus explicitly states that the total population inside the city reached 120,000 people. A city designed to comfortably hold perhaps 10,000 to 15,000 now contained 12 times that number. The overcrowding would prove catastrophic. Streets became impassable, sanitation systems overwhelmed, food supplies strained. The stage was set not just for a siege, but for a humanitarian disaster. As spring 359 turned to summer, these 20,000 soldiers and 100,000 civilians were about to become hostages to a command paralysis that would cost them everything. On the plains east of the Tigris, scouts brought Ursicinus terrifying news. The glittering spectacle Shapur had assembled was unlike anything seen in a generation. And it was heading straight for the one city that couldn't afford to fall. Ammianus Marcellinus, observing from a reconnaissance patrol, recorded what he saw advancing across the Mesopotamian plains. He chose his words carefully, writing for an audience that might doubt the scale of what was coming. The Persian host, he wrote, was a glittering spectacle of mail-clad cavalry filling the hills and dales as far as the eye could reach. Shapur the Second had assembled not just an army, but a coalition of peoples from the Tigris to the steppes of Central Asia. And its size made Roman commanders question whether their intelligence reports could possibly be accurate. Modern historians, analyzing the logistical capacity of the region and the documented casualty figures from what followed, estimate Shapur's total force at between 60,000 and 100,000 warriors. The core of this host was Persian heavy cavalry. The cataphracts and clibanarii, whose very appearance on the battlefield could break enemy morale. Ammianus provides technical descriptions that reveal both his military knowledge and his genuine fear of these troops. The heavy cavalry, he writes, were encased from head to toe in iron plates so precisely fitted that the joints aligned perfectly with their limbs, allowing full mobility while providing near-complete protection. Their helmets featured iron masks, fashioned to resemble human faces, transforming mounted warriors into what Ammianus calls moving iron statues. The psychological impact of a charge by hundreds of these armored horsemen was something Roman troops had learned to dread across decades of Persian wars. But Shapur's army was more than just Persian nobility on armored horses. The coalition structure that made this force so formidable was documented by Ammianus when he later described the siege deployment. The Chionites, under their king Grumbates, provided elite nomadic cavalry. Warriors who'd spent their lives in the saddle and whose hit-and-run tactics had terrorized the eastern frontiers before Shapur forced them into alliance. The Galani contributed tribal warriors from the Caucasus region. The Albani, under their king Urnayr, brought additional mounted forces. The Segestani arrived with a weapon that still featured in 4th century warfare, despite its ancient origins: war elephants. Ammianus describes these massive animals with a mixture of awe and revulsion. Noting their terrible stench, he uses the Latin word fuetor, and their trumpeting that could cause human minds to grasp nothing more terrible. In practice, the elephants would prove less effective than their fearsome reputation suggested, but their psychological impact was real. Crucially, Shapur's army demonstrated sophisticated siege capability. The Persians by 359 had adopted and improved upon Roman siege engineering. They constructed ironclad siege towers that could be wheeled close to enemy walls, mounting ballistae on these towers to clear defenders from the ramparts. They brought equipment for building massive earth mounds, agerhes in Latin, that could serve as assault ramps when raised to wall height, and they possessed captured Roman artillery from previous victories, particularly from the fall of Singara. This was not a cavalry horde that would break against stone walls. This was a combined arms force capable of reducing fortified positions through methodical engineering. The strategic movement of this enormous host revealed the influence of Antoninus's intelligence. Rather than marching directly toward Nisibis, the fortress that had humiliated Shapur 3 times, the Persian army crossed the Tigris and angled toward the Euphrates. Historical sources document that Shapur bypassed Nisibis entirely. This was revolutionary. For 30 years, Persian strategy had fixated on reducing the border fortresses through frontal assault. Now, guided by Roman defector intelligence, Shapur was implementing a deep penetration strategy designed to strike at Syria and trigger the collapse of Roman frontier authority. The original target appears to have been Antioch itself, one of the great cities of the Roman East. Amida wasn't supposed to be a target at all. It was simply another fortress to be bypassed on the road to greater prizes. As the Persian host swept across Mesopotamia, it ravaged the countryside. This wasn't mindless destruction, but calculated terror designed to trigger the refugee crisis that would overwhelm Roman logistics. Farms burned, villages evacuated. The rural population fled toward the fortified cities, carrying what they could and abandoning the rest. The human flood created exactly the chaos Shapur needed. Overstrained garrisons, depleted food supplies, panic undermining military discipline. Ursicinus, watching this catastrophe unfold, took the only action available to a general without an army. He led a cavalry reconnaissance patrol to assess Persian strength and intentions. Ammianus, serving on Ursicinus's staff, accompanied this mission and provides an eyewitness account of what nearly became a disaster. The Roman patrol encountered the Sasanian vanguard near the Tigris. What Ursicinus had hoped would be a quick scouting mission turned into a running fight. The Persian cavalry, recognizing the opportunity to capture a senior Roman commander, pressed the attack aggressively. Only skilled horsemanship and perhaps considerable luck allowed Ursicinus and his staff to escape. They returned to Roman lines with confirmation of the worst fears. The Persian army was professionally organized, massively superior in numbers, and executing a sophisticated strategy that bypassed traditional Roman defensive assumptions. Ursicinus immediately sent urgent dispatches. He ordered the destruction of bridges to force the Persians to ford rivers under fire. He commanded civilian evacuations to remove the refugee burden from garrison cities. He tried to consolidate scattered military units into defensible concentrations. But without Sabinianus's support and without control of the field army, these orders had limited effect. The bridges remained standing. Civilians clogged the roads without military escort. Units retreated in disorder rather than conducting fighting withdrawals. By late August 359, Shapur's vast host approached the one fortress Antoninus had assured him would surrender at the mere sight of his army. The intelligence was sound. Amida's garrison was indeed outnumbered by factors that made resistance seem suicidal. But intelligence, however valuable, couldn't predict human defiance. Amida appeared on the horizon on the third day of Shapur's advance into Mesopotamia. And what happened next would transform a strategic operation into a 73-day bloodbath that would haunt both empires for decades. On the third day of the Persian advance into Mesopotamia, Shapur the Second rode before the walls of Amida to demand its surrender. The King of Kings, mounted on his war charger and wearing his distinctive golden ram's head crown, positioned himself within clear sight of the Roman defenders. This was calculated theater, the overwhelming display of force designed to break enemy will without costly assault. Behind Shapur, visible for miles across the Mesopotamian plain, his coalition army spread across the landscape in what Ammianus, watching from the walls, described as a spectacle of banners and armor that blackened the horizon like a storm front approaching. The psychological impact on the defenders was exactly what Shapur intended. 20,000 Roman soldiers, looking out from Amida's black basalt walls, could see their numerical inferiority made manifest. By all military logic, this should have been the moment when the garrison commanders sent negotiators to arrange terms of surrender. Fortresses facing 5-to-1 odds didn't resist. They capitalized. The mathematical calculation was brutal. Even if every Roman soldier killed 3 Persians before dying, the city would still fall and everyone inside would be slaughtered. Surrender, at least, offered the possibility that Shapur would accept ransom for prisoners, spare the civilian population, and allow the garrison to march out with military honors. But Count Ammianus, commanding the defense of Amida, made a different calculation. Perhaps he recognized that Sabinianus wasn't coming to relieve the city, regardless of whether it resisted or surrendered. Perhaps he understood that the overcrowded condition of Amida, 120,000 people crammed into a space designed for a tenth that number, made the city's situation desperate whether besieged or not. Perhaps he simply refused to hand Shapur a victory that would demoralize every other garrison in Mesopotamia. Whatever his reasoning, Ammianus's response to Shapur's demand was not negotiation. It was defiance. Roman ballistae opened fire. Ammianus, observing the moment, records what happened next with the precision of an eyewitness who understood its significance. A ballista operator somewhere on Amida's walls launched a heavy bolt at the golden crown that made Shapur so clearly identifiable. The shot was extraordinary. Ballista effective range against individual targets was perhaps 100 yards, and accuracy at that distance was far from guaranteed. But the bolt flew true. It missed Shapur's head by what Ammianus describes as a span, the width of a hand. Only a sudden cloud of dust, kicked up by horses or stirred by the wind, obscured the King of Kings from the ballista crews preparing follow-up shots. The dust saved his life. Shapur's reaction, documented by both Roman and later Persian sources, transformed the strategic situation completely. The near assassination enraged him. Chronicles record that he vowed Amida would be razed to its foundations as punishment for daring to threaten the King of Kings. What had been intended as a quick demonstration of force followed by bypass was now a matter of royal honor. Shapur could not withdraw after Roman defenders had nearly killed him. To do so would broadcast weakness across the entire frontier and undermine Persian prestige throughout the coalition. The city that was supposed to surrender had instead declared war, and that declaration would cost both sides catastrophically. But the situation became even more complicated within hours of this confrontation. As Shapur's forces began establishing siege lines around the city, a young prince from the Kyanite contingent approached the walls to inspect Roman defenses. Ammianus identifies him as the son of Grumbates, king of the Kyanites, describing him as a youth of exceptional birth and beauty. The prince's presence near the walls was standard reconnaissance, assessing weak points, estimating defender strength, examining the fortifications. It was also extraordinarily dangerous, which is why it typically fell to young nobles eager to prove their courage. A Roman ballista crew tracked the prince as he moved along the wall perimeter. At a range that demonstrated either remarkable skill or impossible luck, they fired. The heavy bolt struck the Kyanite prince, killing him instantly. The death of a reconnaissance scout should have been a minor tactical incident in a siege involving over 100,000 combatants. Instead, it became the catalyst that transformed Shapur's strategic calculation into something far darker. Ammianus, who'd read Homer and knew his classical literature, chose his comparison carefully. The grief of the Kyanites over the prince's body, he wrote, resembled the grief of the Greeks over the body of Patroclus at Troy. For anyone familiar with the Iliad, this reference carried profound implications. Patroclus's death transformed the Trojan War from a siege into a blood vendetta that demanded total destruction. The coalition army didn't simply mourn. They stopped. Shapur declared a 7-day truce for funeral ceremonies, and what those ceremonies revealed about the political dynamics of the Persian coalition would determine everything that followed. The Kyanite prince's body was placed on a lofty platform. Around it, workers arranged 10 couches bearing lifelike effigies of dead men, a traditional nomadic funerary practice that Ammianus observed with clear fascination. For 7 full days, the various tribal contingents of Shapur's army performed ritual mourning. The Kyanites led sorrowful dirges and dances. The Albani, the Jelani, and the Segestani each contributed their own ethnic funeral traditions. The entire coalition participated, demonstrating that this was not merely a Kyanite loss, but a shared tragedy that bound the Allied forces in common purpose. After 7 days, the prince's body was cremated with great ceremony. His ashes were placed in a silver urn, the wealth represented by silver rather than clay or wood underscoring his royal status. To be returned to his homeland for final burial, Grumbates himself, according to the chroniclers, made a demand that Shapur could not refuse without fracturing his carefully constructed alliance. The city of Amida, Grumbates declared, must be sacrificed to appease the shade of his son. What had begun as a strategic bypass operation had become personal vendetta for Shapur. Now it became blood debt for Grumbates. The King of Kings found himself committed to a siege that his own strategic planning had intended to avoid. Antoninus's intelligence had recommended bypassing fortresses. Military logic argued for continuing the advance towards Syria. But politics and honor now demanded that Amida fall regardless of the cost. As the 7-day funeral period ended, Shapur organized his forces for systematic investment. This wouldn't be a quick assault. This would be methodical siege warfare prosecuted until the city's complete destruction. The King of Kings had learned from his 3 failures at Nisibis. He would apply overwhelming force, sophisticated engineering, and relentless pressure. And he would accept whatever casualties were necessary to deliver the city to Grumbates as payment for his son's blood. Inside Amida, Count Ammianus and his 20,000 soldiers prepared for 73 days of hell. Shapur the Second's organization of the siege revealed both Persian sophistication and the personal nature of what had become a vendetta. Rather than simply surrounding the city with massed troops, the King of Kings deployed his coalition forces according to a careful ethnic and tactical logic that Ammianus would later document when describing the various assault sectors. The Chionites, under Grumbates, received the position of honor, or perhaps of vengeance. They were assigned to the eastern approach, the exact location where the prince had died. This placement was deliberate symbolism. Grumbates' warriors would be the first to breach the walls when the moment came, allowing them to claim rightful blood vengeance. The Golani took responsibility for the southern sector near the Tigris River, where the terrain was difficult but approach was conceivable. The Albani under King Urnair positioned themselves to the north, covering the approaches from the Taurus mountain foothills. The Segestani, accompanied by their war elephants, deployed to the western gate, where the open plains provided the best ground for the massive siege works that would characterize the Persian assault. But the most impressive aspect of Shapur's siege organization was the establishment of what Ammianus calls 5 lines of shields completely encircling the city. This wasn't simply a blockade to prevent escape. It was a sophisticated system of rotating troops that allowed the Persians to maintain constant pressure while preventing exhaustion. Fresh units could rotate to the assault positions while others rested. Supplies could be distributed through the rear lines. Most importantly, any Roman relief force attempting to reach Amida would have to fight through multiple defensive positions before even reaching the city walls. Shapur had learned from decades of warfare. Sieges failed not because walls couldn't be breached, but because relief armies forced the besiegers to fight on 2 fronts simultaneously. The 5-line system meant that even if Sabinianus somehow overcame his paralysis and marched from Edessa, he'd face a prepared Persian defense rather than catching Shapur's forces exposed during an assault. Inside Amida, the reality of 120,000 people in a space designed for 15,000 at most was already creating crisis conditions. The streets were impassable. Families camped in every available courtyard, alley, and public square. The sanitation systems, adequate for a normal population, were overwhelmed within days. Food supplies, which should have sustained a standard garrison for months, would now feed 12 times as many mouths and deplete within weeks. The spring at the citadel's base that Ammianus praised as providing reliable water was indeed functioning, but distributing that water to 120,000 people required constant labor and organization. Count Ammianus faced a command nightmare. His 20,000 soldiers came from multiple legion detachments, auxiliary units, and specialized corps, each with their own command structure and none designed to operate together. The Gallic legions, the Magnentiaci and Decentiaci, were viewed with suspicion by the regular Roman units due to their past support of the usurper Magnentius, The elite household troops like the comites sagittarii considered themselves superior to standard legionaries. The local Mesopotamian auxiliaries spoke Syriac or Aramaic rather than Latin. Creating unified command and maintaining discipline across this disparate force would have been challenging under ideal conditions. Inside an overcrowded city under siege by forces 5 times larger, it required constant effort. The Roman defensive advantages, however, were substantial. Amida's walls, expanded just 10 years earlier by Constantius II, represented Roman military engineering at its 4th century peak. The black basalt construction had proven its durability across 2 decades of weathering and minor skirmishes. The 80-plus towers provided elevated firing positions that multiplied the effectiveness of Roman artillery. And the artillery itself was formidable. Ballistae, heavy, torsion-powered bolt throwers, were positioned on the towers and along the wall platforms. These weapons could fire heavy wooden shafts capable of punching through Persian armor at ranges exceeding 100 yards. Lighter scorpion artillery could hurl stones or smaller bolts with greater rate of fire. The garrison possessed dozens of these weapons, maintained by specialist crews who'd trained for years in their operation. The tactical situation favored the defenders in ways that raw numbers didn't reveal. Siege warfare technology in the 4th century AAD still couldn't breach strong walls without extensive preparation. Shapur's troops would have to construct siege towers tall enough to overlook Amida's ramparts. They'd have to build earth mounds to provide assault ramps. They'd have to protect their siege engines from Roman artillery while those engines hammered the walls. All of this took time, materials, and exposed Persian soldiers to constant defensive fire. If Ammianus could maintain discipline and ration supplies, the city might hold long enough for Shapur to conclude the cost was too high. But there was a darker calculation that both commanders understood. Shapur had committed his prestige and his alliance with Grumbates. He couldn't withdraw without delivering the city. The King of Kings would accept whatever casualties were necessary. Inside Amida, the defenders knew that no relief was coming. Sabinianus remained at Edessa, 100 miles away, with the field army intact but immobile. Ursicinus, the one general who might have attempted a relief operation, lacked the authority to command troops. The garrison was isolated. Their choice was fight or surrender to an enemy who had every reason to show no mercy after 73 days of bloodletting. As September of 359 began, the siege settled into its initial phase. Persian engineers started constructing the siege works while Roman artillery fired at anything that came within range. The casualties began immediately. Both sides were bleeding, but neither side could afford to stop. The question wasn't whether Amida would fall, but whether the price of victory would exceed the value of the prize. The Persian siege works that began rising around Amida demonstrated how thoroughly Shapur had absorbed Roman military engineering. For centuries, siege warfare had been a Roman specialty. The legions built roads, bridges, fortifications, and siege equipment with an efficiency that made them as dangerous as engineers as they were as soldiers. But by the 4th century, Rome's enemies had learned these techniques and, in some cases, improved upon them. Shapur's engineers constructed ironclad siege towers that represented the cutting edge of ancient siege technology. Ammianus provides technical descriptions that reveal both his military education and his assessment of the threat. These towers were built from heavy timbers, reinforced with iron plates on the exterior faces to prevent Roman fire arrows from burning them. They rose on wheeled bases that allowed crews to push them gradually closer to the walls, though this movement required extensive ground preparation to create solid, level approaches. Most threateningly, the towers mounted ballistae on their upper platforms. Once positioned close enough to the walls, Persian artillery crews could fire down onto Roman defenders from protected, elevated positions. The standard Roman counter to siege towers was artillery fire aimed at destroying the structures before they could be deployed effectively. Amida's ballista crews, operating from the city's 80-plus towers, began systematically targeting the Persian construction efforts. The heavy bolts they fired could shatter timber, punch through iron plating if the angle was right, and kill or wound multiple men if they struck groups of workers. The Scorpion artillery, lighter and with faster rate of fire, harassed the Persian engineers constantly. Every timber that had to be hauled into position, every iron plate that had to be affixed, every wheel that had to be constructed. All of this work occurred under fire from defenders who had both height advantage and protected positions. The casualty rates from this phase of the siege, while not documented in detail by Ammianus, would have been steady and grinding. Modern military historians analyzing ancient siege warfare calculate that well-defended cities could inflict losses of 10 to 20% on attacking forces even before major assaults began. For Shapur's army of 60,000 to 100,000, this meant thousands of casualties from the construction phase alone. The Persians weren't just building siege equipment. They were bleeding for every timber and every earth basket. Simultaneously, Persian engineers began constructing earth mounds, agares, designed to provide assault ramps at wall height. This was brutally simple engineering that required massive labor. Workers filled baskets with earth, carried them to the construction site, and dumped them to gradually build a slope rising toward the wall height. The mounds had to be broad enough at the base to support their height and angled carefully to provide stable footing for assault troops. Protecting the workers was nearly impossible. They labored under constant fire from Roman artillery. Shields could block some missiles. Mantelets, portable protective barriers, could provide cover for some workers. But the scale of the operation meant thousands of men worked exposed for hours every day. Ammianus records that the Persians employed a psychological weapon that was ancient even in the 4th century: war elephants. The Segestani contingent brought these massive animals, and their deployment reveals both their lingering military utility and their significant limitations. The elephants served primarily as psychological warfare. Their sheer size was intimidating. The sounds they made, the fouettor or stench that Ammianus mentions with disgust, and the trumpeting that he claims caused human minds to grasp nothing more terrible, created fear among defenders who'd never encountered such creatures before. The Persians also used elephants as mobile siege platforms, mounting howdahs on their backs that could carry archers or even small ballista weapons. But Ammianus also documents the elephant's vulnerability. Roman defenders quickly learned that fire was the elephant's great weakness. The animals had sensitive skin that made them panic when struck by burning missiles. Roman defenders hurled firebrands, essentially flaming javelins, and fired arrows wrapped in oil-soaked cloth set alight. When struck, the elephants would trumpet in pain and panic. In their terror, they would turn and run, often trampling their own Persian infantry. Ammianus notes with some satisfaction that the war elephants, while terrifying in appearance, often proved to be more of a hindrance than a help to the attackers when they were properly countered. The Roman defensive response to Persian siege works wasn't passive. Aelianus ordered the construction of an internal countermound inside the city. The engineering logic was straightforward. If the Persians were building ramps to reach wall height, the Romans needed to maintain fire superiority by building their own elevated positions. Roman engineers and pressed civilian labor began piling earth to create a mound that would overlook the walls and allow defenders to fire down on the Persian siege works. This counter-engineering turned the siege into a vertical race. Whichever side achieved height superiority would gain tactical advantage. The first month of the siege established a grim routine. Persian workers labored under fire to build siege equipment and earth mounds. Roman artillery crews systematically targeted anyone who came within range. Casualties mounted on both sides. Inside the city, the overcrowding was already producing humanitarian crisis. Food supplies depleted faster than planned. The sanitation situation deteriorated despite the garrison's best efforts. Disease began spreading through the cramped quarters where 100,000 civilians lived in conditions that would challenge even a well-supplied city. But the killing remained relatively low intensity compared to what would come. Neither side had yet committed to the massive assaults that would characterize later phases. Shapur was still building his capability. Ammianus was still conserving his forces and waiting for relief that both commanders knew wasn't coming. The siege had begun. The real bloodbath was still ahead. Approximately 3 to 4 weeks into the siege, Ammianus's chronology becomes less precise as events blur together. A Roman deserter approached the Persian lines with information that would nearly end the defense of Amida prematurely. The deserter, whose name and exact motivation are not preserved in the historical record, revealed the existence of a secret passage on the southern side of the city. This was a steep, narrow route used for water access from the Tigris River. Under normal circumstances, it was too difficult and too well watched to serve as an entry point. But the deserter explained the exact path and, crucially, the timing when it might be vulnerable. Shapur's commanders recognized the opportunity immediately. A direct assault on the walls was still weeks away from being feasible. The siege works weren't complete. The mounds hadn't reached sufficient height. But if a small force of elite troops could infiltrate the city and open a gate from inside, or even just create chaos that disrupted the defense, the siege could end with minimal additional Persian casualties. The plan that developed was both audacious and carefully calculated. 70 elite archers from Shapur's personal bodyguard were selected for the mission. Ammianus is specific about this number, which suggests it came from Persian sources or prisoner interrogations after the fact. These weren't ordinary troops. They were chosen from the king's own guard, men whose skill with the bow was exceptional and whose loyalty was absolute. The mission was simple in concept, but extraordinarily dangerous in execution. Use the secret passage to infiltrate the city under cover of darkness, occupy a tower position overlooking the city interior, and at dawn begin firing into the crowded streets to create panic, while the main Persian army launched a general assault on all gates. The infiltration occurred during the night. Moving 70 men silently through dangerous terrain in darkness required meticulous coordination. The archers, traveling light to maximize stealth, made the climb and entered the city through the water access point. They proceeded to a specific tower on the riverbank, the third story. According to Ammianus's detailed account, that would provide clear lines of fire into the city's interior, while being difficult for the garrison to assault quickly. The plan worked flawlessly until dawn. As light broke over Amida, the 70 Persian archers opened fire from their tower position. Their targets weren't the soldiers on the walls, but the civilians and support personnel in the streets below. The panic was immediate. Civilians who'd been relatively safe inside the city suddenly found themselves under fire from what appeared to be breached walls. Screams spread through the overcrowded streets. Simultaneously, the main Persian army launched coordinated assaults on all 4 of Amida's gates. The timing was perfect. Roman commanders on the walls, hearing the chaos behind them and seeing major attacks in front of them, initially believed the walls had been breached in multiple locations. But Count Ammianus and his officers quickly determined the actual situation. The chaos was coming from a single location. The main gates were holding. This wasn't a general breach. It was a limited infiltration. The Roman response demonstrated both the garrison's discipline and their artillery expertise. 5 light ballistae were immediately repositioned for direct fire at the tower occupied by the 70 Persian archers. These lighter ballista weapons could be moved and aimed more quickly than the heavy defensive artillery. At the ranges involved, perhaps 50 to 100 yards, essentially point blank for ballista work. Accuracy was assured. The ballista crews opened fire with coordinated volleys. Ammianus describes the effect with grim precision. The heavy wooden shafts punched through the tower's interior, killing or wounding multiple archers with each shot. At such close range, the bolts maintained enough velocity to transfix armored men and continue through to strike others behind them. The Persians, trapped in an increasingly untenable position, had 2 choices: remain and die under relentless artillery fire, or attempt escape. Most chose the latter. They threw themselves from the tower into the Tigris River below. A fall that would likely prove fatal even if they survived the impact, given the weight of their equipment and the river's current. The entire engagement, from the archers' first shots to their elimination or death by drowning, probably lasted less than an hour. It was a tactical failure for Shapur, but a significant psychological victory for the defenders. The Romans had demonstrated that even when breached, even when facing elite Persian troops in their interior, the garrison could respond effectively. The discipline required to redirect artillery under pressure, to accurately fire into an urban environment without hitting friendly forces, and to eliminate 70 skilled enemy troops in minutes. All of this boosted morale enormously. Following this engagement, Shapur declared a 3-day truce for both sides to burn their dead. This was the second truce of the siege, the first having been the 7-day funeral period for Grumbates' son. The funeral pyres that burned for 3 days provided a grim accounting. The Persians had lost 70 elite bodyguard archers, plus whatever casualties the general assault had produced. The Romans had suffered civilian casualties from the archers' fire and combat losses during the assault on the gates. Ammianus notes that the stench of the funeral pyres filled the air for days afterward, a smell that would become horribly familiar as the siege progressed. The failure of the 70 archers' infiltration revealed something important about the siege's trajectory. Shapur couldn't win through clever tactics or limited operations. The city's defenders were too competent, too well supplied with artillery, and too disciplined to succumb to anything except overwhelming force applied relentlessly. The King of Kings would have to earn Amida through the methodical, grinding siege warfare he'd hoped to avoid. And that meant accepting casualties at a rate that would have caused most ancient commanders to withdraw. But withdrawal was impossible. Grumbates demanded vengeance. Shapur's prestige required victory. The political dynamics of the coalition, the personal vendetta created by the near assassination, and the blood already spilled. All of it trapped both sides in a siege that neither could afford to lose, and that both were paying for in thousands of lives. By the siege's 5th or 6th week, again, Ammianus's chronology compresses multiple events. A crisis of morale was developing among specific garrison units. The Gallic legions, the Magnentiaci and the Decentiaci, were becoming dangerously frustrated with the passive defensive posture that characterized most of Amida's resistance. These units represented a particular Roman military tradition that valued aggressive action and offensive spirit. They were also troops who'd supported the usurper Magnentius and were acutely aware that the imperial court viewed them as politically unreliable. They had everything to prove and were watching the siege from behind walls while Persian forces worked unopposed except for artillery harassment. The catalyst that pushed Gallic frustration into near mutiny was witnessing atrocities in the Persian camp. Roman prisoners taken during the early assault phases were being brutally mistreated in full view of Amida's walls. Women and children captured from rural areas during the Persian advance were tortured. Shapur's forces were deliberately staging these atrocities where they could be seen from the walls. Psychological warfare designed to demoralize the defenders and demonstrate what awaited them if the city fell. For the Gallic warriors, watching this without response was intolerable. Ammianus describes them gnashing their teeth in fury and literally hacking at the city walls in frustration, an image that conveys both their rage and their helplessness. The Gallic legions petitioned Count Ammianus for permission to conduct a night sortie. The request came with an explicit threat. Grant permission, or the Gauls would turn their swords on their own officers and attack anyway. This was the moment when garrison unity hung by a thread. Ammianus could refuse and risk mutiny, which would fracture the defense and possibly lead to civil conflict inside the city, even as Persians attacked from outside. Or he could approve an action that violated every principle of siege warfare. Never expose your limited forces in offensive operations when outnumbered 5-1. Ammianus approved. The decision was probably inevitable given the political dynamics, but it was dressed as military necessity. A limited night sortie against a vastly superior force was normally suicide. But the Gauls weren't proposing a conventional attack. They wanted to strike in darkness using stealth and surprise, inflict maximum casualties on sleeping Persians, and withdraw before organized response could form. It was precisely the kind of aggressive, high-risk operation that matched Gallic warrior traditions. The sortie was organized with care despite its desperate nature. The Gallic legionaries were equipped with axes and swords, close combat weapons suitable for brutal work in darkness. Ammianus doesn't mention armor, which suggests they may have foregone heavy protection in favor of mobility and silence. The timing was chosen for the dead of night, when Persian sentries would be at their least alert and most of the coalition forces would be sleeping. The Gauls slipped out of one of Amida's gates in silence. They moved through the darkness toward the Persian camp, using the terrain and the night to mask their approach. The outer sentries were killed quietly before they could raise the alarm. The Gauls penetrated deep into the Persian camp, moving toward the most important target they could reach: the royal pavilion where Shapur himself slept. The chronicles record that the Gallic warriors nearly reached Shapur's tent before a slight noise alerted the guards. The nature of the noise isn't specified. Perhaps a stumble, perhaps a whispered command. Perhaps simply the sound of so many men moving together proved impossible to completely silence. But the king's guards reacted instantly. The alarm was raised. The Persian camp erupted into chaos. Here, the Gallic plan shifted from assassination attempt to slaughter. Unable to reach Shapur and now facing an alerted enemy, the warriors did what they'd come to do. They killed. In the confined spaces of the camp, in darkness where friend and foe were difficult to distinguish, the close combat weapons that the Gauls carried proved devastatingly effective. Sleeping Persians were cut down before they could arm themselves. Command structures dissolved in confusion. For perhaps 30 minutes to an hour, sections of the Persian camp were scenes of massacre. But the Gallic commanders recognized when the situation had shifted from advantage to danger. As more Persian units organized and began coordinating their response, remaining in the enemy camp guaranteed annihilation. The order was given to withdraw. The Gauls fought their way back toward Amida in good order. a fighting withdrawal that impressed even Ammianus, who generally viewed barbarian auxiliaries with some condescension. They made it back to the city gates and were admitted by defenders who'd been ready to cover their return with artillery fire. The casualty figures for this action aren't preserved with precision. Ammianus states that the Gauls inflicted heavy casualties on sleeping Persians, but doesn't quantify heavy. The Gallic losses are mentioned as moderate, which could mean anywhere from dozens to hundreds. What's clear is that the sortie was considered successful enough that Shapur immediately declared another 3-day truce for the burial of the dead. This was now the third extended pause in the siege for funeral purposes. 7 days after Grumbates' son died, 3 days after the 70 archers were killed, and now 3 days after the Gallic night raid. The psychological impact of the sortie extended far beyond the body count. Inside Amida, the defenders saw that they could still strike back, still inflict pain on an enemy that had seemed untouchable behind its siege works. Morale surged. The Gallic legions had proven their valor in a way that silenced any questions about their loyalty. Unity strengthened. For Shapur, the sortie was a humiliation. The King of Kings had nearly been assassinated in his own tent by enemy troops who penetrated supposedly secure camp perimeters. Security throughout the Persian camp had to be completely overhauled. Guard rotations were increased. Sentries were punished for the breach. The coalition forces, already suffering steady casualties from the siege works, now had to maintain constant vigilance against further night attacks. Fatigue and fear spread through the besiegers. But the sortie also hardened Shapur's determination. If the garrison could still mount offensive operations after 6 weeks of siege, that meant they weren't yet sufficiently worn down. More pressure was needed. More casualties would have to be inflicted. The siege works would be prosecuted even more aggressively. Amida would fall. The cost was secondary to the necessity of victory. As October of 359 arrived, the siege entered its grinding middle phase. Both sides had learned they were facing opponents who wouldn't break easily. Both sides had paid in blood for every yard of ground contested. And the worst was still ahead. Approximately midway through the 73-day siege, the overcrowding that had plagued Amida from the moment 120,000 people crammed into space, designed for 15,000, produced the inevitable catastrophe. Plague. Ammianus's account of this phase reveals both the medical ignorance of the 4th century and the desperate conditions inside the city. The disease outbreak, which Ammianus describes lasting approximately 10 days, was almost certainly typhus or dysentery, conditions that spread rapidly in overcrowded, unsanitary environments. The streets of Amida were filled with human waste. The normal sanitation infrastructure had been overwhelmed within the first weeks of the siege. Bodies of those killed in the Persian assaults or by artillery couldn't always be buried promptly. The late summer and early autumn heat of Mesopotamia accelerated decomposition. Fresh water, despite the reliable spring, had to be distributed to 120,000 people through systems never designed for such volume. Every condition that microbiologists would later identify as ideal for epidemic disease was present inside Amida's walls. The medical response available to 4th century physicians was pitifully inadequate. Ammianus records that many soldiers died while attempting to pull arrows from their own bodies because the city's physicians often forbade treatment of the most severely wounded. This wasn't cruelty, but a triage decision based on limited resources. Treating a soldier with an arrow deep in his torso would consume time, medical supplies, and physician attention that could save 3 soldiers with less severe wounds. In a siege where every fighting man mattered, the brutal calculation was to let the grievously wounded die rather than waste resources on cases likely to be fatal regardless of treatment. The psychological impact of the plague extended beyond the immediate casualties. Soldiers who'd maintained discipline through weeks of bombardment, who'd fought off assaults and endured shortages, now faced an enemy they couldn't fight. Disease didn't care about courage or training. It killed randomly. The uncertainty of who would sicken next, the knowledge that there was no effective treatment, the sight of strong men weakening and dying from invisible causes. All of this eroded morale in ways that Persian attacks hadn't. The civilian population suffered even worse. Elderly refugees who'd fled to Amida for safety died in crowded quarters. Children succumbed to diseases their bodies couldn't fight. Families that had survived the Persian advance across Mesopotamia died together in the supposed safety of the city. The death toll from the 10-day plague outbreak isn't documented with precision, but given the conditions and the population density, it likely numbered in the thousands. Then, according to Ammianus, the plague dissipated following a light rain shower. To modern readers, this claim seems like superstition or divine intervention. But there's actually a reasonable medical explanation. Rain would have cooled the environment, reducing the rate of decomposition and probably lowering the population of disease-carrying insects. It would have provided additional fresh water for cleaning. It might have psychologically encouraged people to improve sanitation efforts. And if the disease was primarily spread through airborne particles or surface contamination, rain could have literally washed away some of the infectious material. Ammianus, writing with the medical understanding of his time, saw the rain as fortunate, if not miraculous. He doesn't explicitly claim divine intervention, but his language suggests he considered the timing remarkably beneficial. The garrison, desperate for any positive sign, certainly interpreted it as evidence that the gods had not abandoned Amida despite appearances. The plague period marked a turning point in the siege's dynamics. Before the outbreak, Count Ammianus could still imagine scenarios where the garrison outlasted Persian patience. Shapur had already lost thousands of men. The siege works were progressing, but at enormous cost. If the King of Kings decided the price was too high, he might withdraw and continue his advance towards Syria, leaving Amida bypassed but intact. The plague shattered this hope. The 10 days of epidemic had killed enough defenders and civilians that supplies, which had been critically short, were now merely insufficient. The garrison was weaker. Morale had taken a blow that no tactical victory could fully repair. For Shapur, observing from outside the walls, the plague was both opportunity and warning. Opportunity because the garrison was clearly suffering, clearly weakening, clearly approaching the limits of endurance. Warning because disease in a besieged city could spread to the besieging army if conditions deteriorated further. Persian troops were also living in concentrated camps, also dealing with sanitation challenges, also vulnerable to epidemic. If Shapur continued the siege too long, his own forces might suffer similar outbreaks. These competing pressures pushed both commanders toward the same conclusion. The siege needed to end soon. For Ammianus, that meant the city would fall unless relief arrived, or Shapur withdrew. And neither seemed likely. For Shapur, it meant intensifying the siege works to bring the matter to conclusion before disease or winter or Roman reinforcements from the west could change the calculation. The Persian siege mounds were now approaching wall height. The towers were nearly ready for final positioning. The artillery duel between Roman ballistae and Persian engines continued to produce steady casualties on both sides. Inside Amida, the Roman countermound was keeping pace with the Persian earthworks, maintaining the fire superiority that had made assault prohibitively costly so far. But the countermound represented a gamble. It was being constructed rapidly under pressure, using whatever earth and materials were available. built not by professional engineers with time to ensure stability, but by garrison soldiers and pressed civilians working frantically to maintain defensive advantage. As the siege entered its final phase, both sides were racing toward conclusions. Shapur was racing to complete siege works and execute the final assault before disease or political pressure forced withdrawal. Ammianus was racing to maintain defensive capability despite dwindling supplies, weakened garrison, and deteriorating conditions. And the Roman countermound, rising higher every day inside the city, was about to become the pivot point that would determine everything. The engineering flaw that would doom 20,000 Romans was already present in the hastily constructed earthwork. It simply hadn't manifested yet. When it did, the transformation from siege to sack would take less than an hour. On the 73rd day of the siege, the Roman countermound collapsed. Ammianus, who witnessed the disaster, describes it as happening suddenly, as if leveled by an earthquake. The metaphor wasn't hyperbole. The mound, constructed hastily from whatever earth and material could be gathered, lacked proper structural foundation. The weight of the accumulated earth, combined with the constant vibrations from artillery fire and the stress of men moving across its surface, had created instabilities invisible from outside. Internal voids, uncompacted sections, improper drainage, all the engineering flaws that professional builders would have identified and corrected, were present and growing worse daily. The collapse likely began with a deep internal failure that manifested on the surface as sudden total structural breakdown. One moment, Roman defenders occupied positions on the mound that overlooked both the city interior and the walls. The next, the earth was falling away beneath them, sliding and tumbling in a mass of dust and debris. Men scrambled to escape the collapse. Some made it. Others were buried or fell from heights that broke bones and ended their ability to fight. The tactical implications were immediate and catastrophic. The Roman countermound had served two critical functions: maintaining fire superiority over the Persian siege works and blocking the gap between the wall top and the approaching Persian assault mounds. With the countermound gone, the Persian mounds essentially formed a bridge into the city. There was no longer a drop from the wall height to the city interior. There was now a ramp leading directly from Persian assault positions into Amida's streets. The Persian forces, observing the collapse, recognized the opportunity instantly. Shapur's trumpet sounded the general assault. Warriors who'd been manning the siege works or waiting in the five-line formation surrounding the city surged forward. The King of Kings himself, according to the chroniclers, abandoned his command position and fought like a common infantryman. This personal participation wasn't ceremonial. Shapur, at approximately 50 years old, was still physically formidable and understood that his presence in the breach would inspire his troops to maximum effort. The Roman defenders rushed to the breach point, attempting to form a human wall where the earthwork had stood. What followed was fighting of an intensity that impressed even Ammianus, who'd witnessed multiple battles. The gap left by the mound's collapse was perhaps 20 to 30 yards wide, enough for dozens of men to fight simultaneously, but narrow enough that numerical superiority was partially negated by crowding. The close-quarters combat featured every weapon imaginable: swords, axes, spears, daggers, shields used as bludgeons, helmets used to bash enemies when primary weapons broke. Ammianus's description of the fighting reveals what modern readers might find most shocking: the sheer physical compression of the combat. Bodies of the slain, he writes, were held upright by the density of the throng, unable even to fall to the ground. The living and the dead were pressed together so tightly that corpses couldn't collapse. Warriors fought standing on fallen bodies, stabbing and hacking at enemies inches away, breathing air thick with dust and blood and the exhalations of thousands of men in mortal struggle. The Roman defense at the breach was characterized by what Ammianus calls more fury than discretion. The defenders recognized that all was lost. There would be no relief. There would be no surrender terms. The city had held for 73 days and cost the Persians 30,000 dead. Shapur would show no mercy after such losses. The only choice was to die fighting or die on execution crosses. After capture, the Romans chose to make their last stand as expensive as possible for the attackers. For perhaps an hour, the breach held. Roman discipline and desperation matched Persian numbers and momentum. But the fundamental mathematics couldn't be overcome. For every Persian who fell, 2 more could push forward. For every Roman who died, there was no replacement. The garrison was finite. Shapur's reserves seemed inexhaustible. The exact moment when the Roman line broke isn't documented with precision. Ammianus, fighting for his own survival, wasn't taking notes. But at some point during the afternoon or early evening of day 73, Persian forces burst through the breach in numbers that overwhelmed the defensive formation. Once the breach was fully penetrated, the end was inevitable. Persian troops spread through the city streets. Roman formations fragmented. Organized resistance became individual last stands. The siege became a sack. The sack of Amida was, in Ammianus's words, a scene of unmitigated carnage. Persian troops, enraged by 73 days of siege and 30,000 comrades dead, gave no quarter. Roman soldiers attempting to surrender were cut down. Civilians who'd survived the siege and the plague died in the streets. Buildings were set alight. Groups of defenders trapped in structures were burned alive. The narrow streets became killing grounds where retreat was impossible, and surrender meant death anyway. Count Ammianus, the garrison commander who'd held the city for 73 days against impossible odds, was captured alive along with his senior tribunes. His fate was already determined. He would be gibbeted, publicly executed by hanging, as punishment for the prolonged resistance that had cost Shapur so dearly. The tribunes would die alongside him as a message to any other Roman garrison considering similar defiance. In the chaos and carnage of the city's final hours, Ammianus Marcellinus recognized that his only chance for survival was escape. Along with a few companions whose names he doesn't preserve, Ammianus made his way to a postern gate, a small side entrance, probably less guarded or watched during the general slaughter. Under cover of darkness and confusion, he slipped out of the dying city. The flight that followed tested Ammianus's endurance. He traveled 10 miles on foot through the night, suffering from what he describes as severe thirst and exhaustion. His military training and his acquaintance with the area, gained from previous reconnaissance missions and campaigns, allowed him to navigate by darkness, probably following the Tigris River valley northward. By dawn, he'd put enough distance between himself and Amida to have some reasonable hope of escaping Persian patrols. He eventually reached Melitene, a Roman city approximately 100 miles north, and from there returned to Antioch. Ammianus's escape is historically significant for a simple reason. Without it, we would have no detailed account of the siege. His survival meant that the eyewitness testimony of Amida's 73 days could be preserved. Every modern historian who studies late Roman military history, Romano-Persian relations, siege warfare, or 4th century geopolitics relies on Ammianus's account. His 10-mile flight in darkness literally saved the historical record. Behind him, the city he left was consuming itself in fire and blood. The 73-day siege had ended. Now came the aftermath, when victory and defeat both revealed their full cost. The day after Amida fell, Shapur the Second surveyed what he'd won. The cost was documented by sources on both sides, and the figures remain shocking even by the brutal standards of ancient warfare. Of the approximately 60,000 to 100,000 warriors who'd begun the siege, the King of Kings had lost 30,000 dead. Ammianus states this number explicitly, and modern historians generally accept it as plausible, given the siege's 73-day duration and the intensity of the fighting. Think about the mathematics of that loss. If Shapur's force was 60,000, he'd lost 50% of his army. If it was 100,000, he'd still lost 30%. Either ratio represents catastrophic attrition. For comparison, most ancient armies that suffered 25 to 30% casualties in a single engagement were considered to have been decisively defeated. Shapur had won and absorbed losses that would normally signify total defeat. The casualty distribution across the 73 days would have been uneven. The construction phases probably produced steady but moderate losses, perhaps 100 to 300 per day from Roman artillery fire. The major assault attempts during the attempted infiltrations and after the mound collapse would have produced spikes of thousands of casualties in single days. Disease in the Persian camp, while not documented by the sources, almost certainly killed additional hundreds given the concentration of forces and the autumn weather. The 30,000 figure represents a minimum of 400 deaths per day on average. But the reality was likely periods of light casualties punctuated by days where thousands died. For the garrison, the accounting was simpler and total. Of 20,000 soldiers inside Amida, few, if any, escaped. Ammianus uses this exact phrase, few, if any, which suggests that his own escape was exceptional and that the survival rate for the garrison was effectively zero. Some were killed during the 73-day siege. Many died in the final assault and subsequent sack. The remainder were captured. Count Ammianus and his tribunes faced immediate execution. They were gibbeted in public displays designed to send a message to other Roman garrisons. The message was clear. Prolonged resistance would not be rewarded with honorable terms. Commanders who cost Shapur dearly would pay with their lives. The executions were meant to encourage future surrenders and discourage future 73-day stands. The fate of the surviving soldiers and the civilian population was deportation. Shapur organized the captives for forced march deep into Persian territory, specifically to the province of Khuzestan in southwestern Persia. This wasn't unique to Amida. Persian kings had a long tradition of deporting conquered populations to repopulate their own territories and provide labor for agricultural and construction projects. The deportees would become peasants working Persian lands, laborers on Persian building projects, or household servants. They would never see Mesopotamia again. Ammianus records details of the deportation march that reveal deliberate cruelty alongside the normal brutality of ancient warfare. Elderly captives who gave out along the route and couldn't continue marching had their calves or hams cut out. The purpose was twofold. It prevented them from attempting escape once the column moved on, and it ensured death from blood loss or infection. This wasn't pragmatic necessity, a soldier's mercy killing. This was intentional prolonged suffering inflicted on people who could no longer be economically useful as slaves. The number of civilian dead inside Amida is impossible to calculate with precision. Of the approximately 100,000 civilians trapped inside the walls, many died during the siege from Persian bombardment, from the plague, from starvation as supplies dwindled, Many more died during the final sack when Persian troops swept through the city, killing indiscriminately. The survivors, perhaps 50,000 to 70,000, faced the deportation march. How many of those survived the journey to Khuzestan? How many died on the road? And what percentage of the original 100,000 civilians lived beyond the first year after the siege? The sources simply don't tell us. The physical destruction of Amida itself was extensive but incomplete. Persian forces looted everything of value. Buildings were burned or torn down. Ammianus records that the city's residential structures were largely leveled, but the walls remained. Despite 73 days of battering and Shapur's rage at the city's defiance, the black basalt fortifications proved too formidable to destroy. Roman engineering had created walls that could be taken, but not broken. The irony was complete. Shapur won the city, but couldn't erase the fortifications that had cost him so dearly. The strategic situation immediately following Amida's fall revealed the pyrrhic nature of Shapur's victory. The King of Kings had intended to bypass fortresses and strike Syria. Amida was supposed to be ignored on the route to greater prizes. Instead, he'd spent 73 days reducing one city. He'd lost 30,000 men, more than the entire defending garrison. And autumn was turning to winter, which meant campaigning season was ending. The Syrian offensive that Antoninus had recommended was no longer feasible. Shapur's army, depleted by a third or half, needed time to recover. The survivors needed rest. Wounded needed treatment. The coalition allies who'd lost thousands to capture one Roman city were questioning whether future operations would justify the cost. Shapur retreated, not in disorderly flight, but in organized withdrawal to consolidate his gains. He'd captured Amida. In the following year, he would take Singara and Bazabde as well. But the deep penetration into Syria never materialized. The 30,000 graves around Amida had consumed the momentum of his invasion. The greatest Persian offensive since the early Sasanian period had been blunted by 20,000 Romans and 100,000 civilians who turned their certain death into strategic delay. Inside the Roman Empire, news of Amida's fall produced shock and recrimination. Sabinianus, still at Edessa with his intact field army, faced no immediate punishment. His court connections protected him. Ursicinus, the general who'd tried to organize defense despite lacking authority, was dismissed from command. The scapegoating was complete. The competent general blamed, the paralyzed political appointee retained. It exemplified everything that was dysfunctional about late Roman military command. Emperor Constantius, receiving reports in Constantinople or Antioch, reportedly understood the magnitude of the disaster. A major city lost, multiple legion detachments annihilated, 120,000 Romans dead or deported, the eastern frontier's defensive network compromised. But the emperor's options were limited. The western provinces still demanded troops. Court politics still trumped military competence. And Shapur, despite his losses, still commanded the largest Persian army in living memory. The accountings from both sides pointed to the same conclusion. Amida was a tactical victory for Persia and a strategic catastrophe for both empires. Shapur won the city, but lost his invasion. Rome lost the city, but bought time for the frontier. And 30,000 Persian dead, plus 20,000 Roman dead, testified to the siege's unique distinction: the highest cost-to-benefit ratio in ancient siege warfare. The immediate aftermath of Amida's fall reverberated through both the Roman and Persian empires for the next 4 years, ultimately producing consequences that would reshape the eastern frontier for generations. The 20,000 dead Romans and 30,000 dead Persians weren't just casualties. They were political facts that drove strategic decisions across the Mediterranean and Mesopotamian worlds. For Shapur the Second, the victory at Amida confirmed that Roman fortresses could be reduced, but only at costs that made systematic conquest economically unsustainable. Over the next 2 years, he would leverage the momentum from Amida's capture to take Singara in 360 and Bezabde shortly after. These additional fortress conquests achieved what 3 decades of intermittent warfare had failed to accomplish. They fundamentally compromised the Roman defensive network in Mesopotamia. But they also confirmed the pattern established at Amida. Each fortress fell. Each victory cost thousands of Persian lives. The cumulative effect was that Shapur's coalition, which had numbered upwards of 100,000 warriors in 359, required 10 years to rebuild to comparable strength. The Roman response to Amida's fall went through multiple phases. Initially, there was paralysis. Constantius II, dealing with multiple crises simultaneously, lacked the military resources to immediately counterattack in the east. Sabinianus remained inactive at Edessa. The field army that might have relieved Amida before its fall certainly didn't sortie afterward to contest Shapur's consolidation. The dismissal of Ursicinus removed the one Roman general with both competence and experience in Persian warfare. The eastern frontier essentially conceded Mesopotamia and focused on defending Syria. But in 361, the political situation transformed when Julian became sole emperor. Julian, who'd proven his military capability in Gaul, represented everything Constantius had feared: a competent general with imperial ambitions. When Constantius died in 361, while maneuvering to oppose Julian militarily, the younger man inherited an empire in crisis. And Julian's response to the Persian problem was characteristically ambitious and ultimately catastrophic. In 363, Julian launched the largest Roman offensive against Persia in decades. He assembled an army estimated at 65,000 troops, comparable to Shapur's 359 host, and invaded Persia proper rather than simply attempting to recapture lost fortresses. The strategy was Alexandrian: strike at the heart of Persian power, force Shapur into decisive battle, crush him completely. Initially, the campaign succeeded. Julian defeated Persian forces in several engagements and advanced to Ctesiphon, the Sasanian capital on the Tigris. But he couldn't capture the city. Supply lines stretched dangerously thin. Persian scorched earth tactics denied the Romans foraging opportunities. And Shapur, having learned from confronting Roman fortresses how costly frontal assaults could be, refused to give Julian the decisive battle he sought. In June of 363, during a running engagement near Samarra, Julian was killed. The exact circumstances remain disputed by historians. Persian sources claim a Sasanian cavalryman's lance struck him. Some Roman sources suggest he was assassinated by a Christian in his own army, who opposed Julian's attempts to restore paganism as the state religion. What's not disputed is that the emperor's death stranded a 65,000-man Roman army deep in hostile territory without clear leadership. The army elected Jovian, a senior officer, as the new emperor. Jovian's priority was simple survival: extract the army from Persia before Shapur could trap and destroy it. But extraction required negotiation. And Shapur, recognizing Roman desperation, demanded terms that reversed a century of territorial arrangements. The Treaty of 363 was a humiliation for Rome. Nisibis, the fortress that had resisted Shapur 3 times in the 330s through 350s, was ceded to Persia. Singara and the other Mesopotamian fortresses captured since 359 were formally acknowledged as Persian. 5 Roman provinces were transferred to Sasanian control. Armenia, which had been within the Roman sphere of influence, was abandoned to Persian pressure. The direct causal line from Amida to the Treaty of 363 is clear. Amida's 73-day resistance in 359 delayed but didn't stop Shapur's offensive. The subsequent Persian gains between 359 and 361 created the frontier crisis that Julian attempted to solve with his invasion. Julian's death during that invasion forced the catastrophic treaty, and the treaty established a new eastern frontier that favored Persia and would remain largely stable until the Islamic conquests in the 7th century. Militarily, the siege of Amida entered the historical record as a case study in multiple aspects of warfare. For siege warfare specialists, it demonstrated that sophisticated engineering could overcome even the strongest fortifications given sufficient time and acceptable casualties. The Persian siege works, ironclad towers, coordinated artillery, systematic mound construction, represented 4th century siegecraft at its peak. The Roman counter-engineering showed creativity, but also revealed the dangers of hasty construction under pressure. For command and control analysts, Amida exemplified how political dysfunction could cripple military effectiveness. The Ursus-Sabinianus conflict wasn't unique to 359. It represented a systemic problem in late Roman civil-military relations where court favor mattered more than competence. The outcome, competent general dismissed, political general retained, sent clear signals throughout the imperial bureaucracy about what was rewarded and what was punished. For logistics and sustainment planners, the siege demonstrated the catastrophic effects of population displacement in warfare. The 100,000 refugees who crowded into Amida created a humanitarian disaster that undermined the garrison's ability to resist. The plague outbreak was inevitable given the overcrowding. The rapid supply depletion was mathematically certain. Future Roman defensive planning would have to account for refugee management or risk repeating Amida's suffering. For coalition warfare, Shapur's management of diverse allied forces provided both positive and negative lessons. Positive: he successfully integrated Persians, Chionites, Gilani, Albani, and Segestani into a functional combined force. Negative: the death of Grumbates' son revealed how ethnic allies' political demands could override strategic logic. Shapur's commitment to the 73-day siege was partly driven by the need to maintain coalition unity by satisfying Grumbates' blood debt. The question for future commanders was whether such commitments were worth the cost. The cultural memory of Amida diverged significantly between Roman and Persian traditions. Roman sources, following Ammianus, remembered the siege as heroic defense against overwhelming odds. Count Ammianus and his 20,000 became exemplars of courage and sacrifice. The 73-day resistance became a symbol of Roman endurance, even in the face of inevitable defeat. The garrison's infliction of 30,000 casualties on the attackers was emphasized to show that even Roman defeat was costly for Rome's enemies. Persian traditions, preserved in later Islamic-era histories that drew on lost Sasanian sources, remembered Amida as evidence of Shapur the Second's determination and ultimate triumph. The siege was one element in a broader narrative of Shapur's 70-year reign as a period of Persian resurgence and Roman retreat. The costs were acknowledged but contextualized within the larger strategic gains that culminated in the Treaty of 363. The archaeological legacy exists today in Diyarbakir, Turkey, where Amida's black basalt walls still stand. The 5.8-kilometer circuit of fortifications remains largely intact, a testament to 4th century Roman engineering. Visitors can walk on the walls where Count Ammianus positioned his ballistae. They can see the Tigris River that formed the city's natural barrier. They can stand where Shapur's siege works rose and where the Persian dead piled 20,000 deep. UNESCO designated the site a World Heritage Location in 2015, recognizing both the architectural significance and the historical importance of the fortifications that witnessed one of ancient warfare's most costly sieges. Modern military historians continue to study Amida for lessons about siege warfare, asymmetric resistance, and the interaction of tactical outcomes with strategic consequences. The siege remains the definitive example of a pyrrhic victory, where the winner's costs exceeded the value of the prize. Shapur won the city. The victory helped him extract favorable terms 4 years later. But 30,000 dead warriors represented a loss that the Persian Empire struggled for a decade to replace. Meanwhile, 20,000 Roman dead and 100,000 Roman deported or killed created a demographic and military void in Mesopotamia that contributed to the region's vulnerability when new threats emerged in subsequent centuries. The 73 days that Amida held became a measuring stick for garrison endurance. When later sieges occurred, Constantinople resisting Arab attacks in the 8th century, Vienna holding against Ottoman forces in the 16th century, Stalingrad grinding through months of Soviet-German combat in the 20th century. Military analysts compared the defensive determination to what Ammianus documented at Amida. The siege entered the canon of military history as proof that motivated defenders in strong positions could inflict disproportionate casualties even against vastly superior attackers. The question was always whether inflicting such casualties mattered if the city fell anyway. For Shapur the Second, Amida represented both vindication and warning. Vindication, because he'd proven that no Roman fortress, however strong, was impregnable. Warning, because the costs of methodical reduction made conquest of the entire Roman East economically impossible. The King of Kings would reign for another 20 years after Amida, dying in 379 at age 70, one of the longest reigning monarchs in ancient history. His legacy included the territorial gains formalized in 363 and the restoration of Persian prestige after decades of Roman military superiority. But his legacy also included the 30,000 graves around Amida as a permanent reminder of the limits of Persian power. For the Roman Empire, Amida was a wound that never fully healed. The loss of Mesopotamia shifted the frontier westward and placed Syria under more direct threat. The demographic catastrophe of 100,000 Romans killed or deported weakened the population base that supported frontier defense. The military catastrophe of losing multiple legion detachments simultaneously created gaps in the order of battle that took years to fill. And the political catastrophe of the Ursicinus-Sabinianus dysfunction revealed systemic problems in late Roman command structure that would continue plaguing military effectiveness for another century. But Amida also revealed Roman resilience. The garrison that held for 73 days against 5-to-1 odds demonstrated that Roman military culture still produced soldiers willing to die rather than surrender. The engineering that created walls Shapur couldn't destroy, even after victory, showed that Roman building techniques remained world-class. And the eyewitness account that Ammianus preserved by escaping ensured that the sacrifice wouldn't be forgotten. In an empire increasingly plagued by disasters, defeats, and internal decay, the memory of Amida provided evidence that Romans could still fight, still endure, still cost their enemies dearly even in defeat. For 10 years after that autumn of 359, Shapur the Second approached Roman fortresses with newfound caution. The man who'd assembled 100,000 warriors and sacrificed 30,000 to take a single city had learned that numerical superiority didn't guarantee affordable victory. When he finally sat across from Roman negotiators in 363 to dictate the terms that reversed a century of territorial arrangements, Both sides understood what Amida had proven. Even Roman defeat was catastrophically expensive for Rome's enemies. Count Ammianus and his 20,000 soldiers bought 10 years with their 73 days. They transformed certain death into strategic delay. They proved that courage and engineering could multiply effectiveness far beyond what mathematics suggested possible. And they left a question that military historians still debate. If a siege kills more attackers than the entire defending garrison, who really won? Ammianus Marcellinus, who escaped through a postern gate on the 73rd night, spent the rest of his life writing the history that preserved their sacrifice. Without his 10-mile flight through darkness, without his survival to compile his res gestae, the greatest siege of the 4th century would be lost to historical memory. Instead, it remains documented in precise detail, a testament to what 20,000 could accomplish against 100,000 when walls were strong and determination was absolute. The black basalt walls of Amida still stand in Diyarbakir, Turkey, 5.8 kilometers of Roman engineering that Shapur's engineers couldn't destroy even after the city fell. Tourists walk where Roman ballistae fired. Archaeologists excavate where Persian dead pile deep. UNESCO protects the site as World Heritage, recognizing that these stones witnessed history's most expensive tactical victory and most effective tactical defeat. When faith meets superior numbers, when courage confronts overwhelming force, when engineering multiplies effectiveness beyond mathematical expectation, we see Amida's shadow. The siege proved that sometimes, just sometimes, the question isn't who wins, but what victory costs. Shapur won the city, but lost his invasion. Ammianus lost his life, but saved the frontier. And those 73 days in autumn of 359 changed the balance of power between empires for the next 270 years, until the very walls both sides fought over became frontiers of a new empire neither Roman nor Persian could have imagined. That dying garrison with dwindling supplies held back the tide of history itself. And the cost of finally breaking through consumed the army that won.